Now, what can we do more to develop awareness about the importance of preserving records? Because we are a people that like to throw things away.
Yes.
And sometimes we really don't know what we're throwing away. Sometimes you throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
As we say. So what can be done to really bring awareness about the preservation of records? Because if we don't keep certain records, what you're doing is that maybe history will not forgive you. In the sense that you will have nothing
Yeah.
to trace, to look back at. I didn't want to mention his name, but our national hero, the most recent one, the Right Excellent and Right Honorable Sir Kennedy Alphonse Simmons, told me the other day that he was visiting the archives and looking for certain things. And then he said to me, I am not really doing it for me. He says, but I would like my grandchildren to have something, to know something. And so in a certain sense, the preservation of records is really basically about the preserving of history.
Yes.
Generations to come
Yes.
after us who can have something to look back on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what can be done?
There are a number of things. Let's start with government. Government needs to look after its own records.
Yes.
And that's where records management and proper record keeping come in. I understand where some of the neglect came from. A lot of people grew up in that transition period in the 60s when we were looking after our own affairs.
I wasn't born yet.
I was, but I wasn't here.
Okay.
You know, there was that transition when the civil service was being asked to look after things, but they weren't really being shown how it was to be done. They were being told they have to classify. And I've seen evidence of courses upon courses upon courses about classification and, you know, how records should be treated and so on and things like that. I think we're at the stage now where we're beginning to value ourselves. And that's something very, very important. You keep records if you feel you have value. If you want to pass something on to your children. Before I left Malta, I asked my mother to give me whatever photographs she could. At the time, she didn't have many. But then my aunt died, and a lot of these papers came to my mom, and I didn't want to deprive her of them, so I asked my nephew and niece to scan them for me. So I have scans, and I can share those with my kids. And I can tell them the names of their great-great-great-grandparents, you know, going back to about 1820.
The genealogy.
Yes. I'm not a big fan of genealogy, but I know there are people who are, and I will help them to whatever extent I can.
Right.
And I'm quite happy about the fact that I can look up at a sheet of paper and tell them, okay, this was your great-great-grandfather, you know? And the fact that there is also a photograph of him somewhere. So these are things that I think families appreciate, especially once you start to feel that community, the need to pass on something to your kids. I think for a long time, because serious land ownership wasn't part of the ethic of the whole culture of St. Kitts. That might have been one of the reasons why a lot of things just weren't looked after.
Right.
The fact that there was so much migration, you know, people moving up and down.
That is correct.
Yeah, the climate. Because I mean, it's still there. Every Christmas, you see bundles of papers outside houses.
Yes.
The garbage bins are full of
Right.
things that people are throwing out. Some of it needs throwing out for true, but then look and see if there's something in there which maybe you don't want, but maybe it's helpful for something else. You could put a limit. Say this item, I'm donating this item, but I don't want it made public for another 50 years.
Right.
We're happy to do that. We actually have a document which you can sign, and we will co-sign and agree to that sort of thing.
Which brings me to an interesting question. What criteria basically would one use for keeping or discarding something?
The long-term value of it. I wouldn't want to throw away my grandmother's photograph.
Right.
Because I know she's my grandmother.
So the keeping or discarding, is it more something that is personal?
Within the family context, yes.
Within the family context?
Yes. But within government, no. It all depends. You have to look at why that record was generated, what it was supporting, what program it was supporting, if there's legislation for it to be kept that requires its keeping, things like that. So within government, it can be a lot more serious than simply an emotional tie to something.
Now, do governments destroy documents?
Yes, they do. And
not always for noble reasons.
Yes. Yes, there's evidence of that happening all over the world. I remember when I was doing my master's, reading cases in Australia. You know, people didn't want things becoming public about, say, the treatment of the Aboriginal children, the stolen generations, they call them there. The Enron case.
Yes.
That involved a lot of record destruction. There's always record destruction. Sometimes it's permitted, and that is something we're trying to put in place now. We would like to see retention schedules published in the Gazette, so people are aware that something may not be available after a certain time.
Right.
You know, but at the same time, I mean, things can disappear.
Now, with, for example, freedom of information legislation, how will that impact your National Archives?
It impacts everybody who takes care of records. Freedom of information is usually something the press loves a lot.
Yes.
But we have to be aware of what can be made public and what there are always exceptions.
The classifieds and the unclassifieds.
Yeah. If something is from national security, from the defense force, anything that could impact the safety of the country, then there's always a restriction on it. And we would enforce that. If the record comes to us within a certain period, we would enforce that. Cabinet decisions and things like that, they have, I think, a 50-year closure period.
Okay. After 50 years, you can.
After 50 years, you can. No.
That's right. Okay, right.
No. No. Cabinet decisions, cabinet submissions, those are the key to government, the working of government.
Right.
So they have a permanent retention attached to them. A lot of different minutes of organizations and committees and so on, depending on the level of the committee it's working on. Those would probably be permanent retention as well. Things that your office produces, the videos
and all of that.
Not all the press releases. I find sometimes that they can. We had some where we got kind of start here and close there. You know, the queue in and queue out.
Oh right.
Which made them horrible to keep because you didn't know what they were queuing in and queuing out.
The queuing in and the queuing out basically are for the radio.
Yes.
It's for audio,
yes.
but those are not supposed to come as press releases.
Unfortunately, they
those
came
should
to
only
us
go to the radio stations.
They came to
Yes.
us as press releases, and that's all that we had to work on,
Right.
which means that they're practically useless.
Right.
The Prime Minister's speeches, probably other ministers of government, reports that are published, or even for internal use. All these things should come to us.
So you have multimedia.
Yes.
You have audio and you
Yeah.
have visual.
Yes.
And you have text.
Yes, yes, we do. And then the whole idea would be for people to, like for instance with government, if you have a consultant coming in to deal with a particular project, he might need or she might need information that was not created by that department.
Right.
You know? So if it's in archives, we've put it in a particular place,
Yes.
and we keep a record, and we know the item is there, and it's in a searchable spreadsheet or something
Sure.
like that, and then we can make it available to whoever needs it, as long as it's not classified.
Sure. Sure.
So freedom of information, yes. The other item would be data protection and privacy. That's another thing that we need to look after, and that is why we insist that if we're throwing away records, they are destroyed rather than thrown away.
Yes.
You know, the ideal would be for us to have our own shredders,
Sure.
a semi-industrial type thing, and push everything through. Maybe the cross-cut, so
Right.
nobody can
Right.
take time to paste
Right,
them back
right.
together, you know, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Nobody can get their hands on.
Yes, yes. We're also aware that certain things, because of the privacy issues, personnel records tend to have a longer closure
Sure,
period
sure.
as well. Sometimes some of them are not kept at all.
Right.
We try to keep things like heads of department, ministers.
So who was the head of
governors.
department at a particular time?
Yeah. Or if there was somebody in that particular department who made a very good contribution to the community.
Yes.
These people usually stand out.
Sure.
And you see the name and you tell yourself, okay, I'm pulling this one.
Sure. Okay, good. Now, we have had many years, of course, you know, of colonialism, slavery, and basically the plantation was the center of social, economic, and political activity.
Yes.
It really was at the center of everything, so to speak. And we have had sugar plantations. We have produced sugar. We had a factory here that produced sugar,
My husband worked there.
molasses. Your husband works there.
Worked.
Worked.
Yes.
And so on. And St. Kitts is no longer producing sugar. I think it was in 2005,
Yes.
if I am correct,
Yeah.
that
The official closure.
the official closure of the sugar industry. Is that the closure of our history with sugar that has dominated for over perhaps even 400 years? And what really can be done in terms of the preservation of that history? We have a sugar factory. What can be done with it?
The sugar factory itself, that's a big problem, because it needed a lot of expense to make it safe for people to visit. But there were moves to try and select certain things that could have been preserved, and unfortunately it has not been done. The preservation of artifacts and so on is not my field, so I prefer not to
delve
deal
into
with that. Yeah, the trust and specialized people like Cameron Gill,
Sure.
who has done museum and artifact preservation
Right.
and so on. Those are people who would know a
To
lot
speak more
more
on that.
on that sort of thing. So I will leave that to them.
Sure.
My concern is the records
Mhm.
at the sugar factory,
Right.
which are not in the custody of the archives yet. It worries me. It keeps me up at night sometimes. I find myself in a really nice sleep, and all of a sudden visions of the records at the sugar factory come into my dreams, and I start to wonder how on earth I'm going to keep them safe. Because this is the history not just of ownership, but of people who were employed there. As I said, my husband was a machinist there back in the 70s.
Yes.
Before he went off to study.
Sure.
He came back, he was their shop steward still. Things like that. And he used to talk to me about the railwaymen. He used to represent them in the union. The machinists, all sorts of people there. And we're already getting queries. Somebody will walk in, my uncle used to work on such and such an estate.
Right.
What do you know about him? I can't even tell them, yes, you're right. But the records are there. But they're not with us because we don't have the space for them. And you know what's even stranger?
Are they in jeopardy there?
The people close to the factory are doing their best to keep them safe. But I'm not happy because we cannot monitor their condition. They're not in the best condition.
Right.
And we don't know what's happening in the particular room where they're in. Right? So they might be safe, but not very safe.
Yes.
And I want to be able to tell Tom Jones and Mary Smith, yes, your father worked there. This was his salary. He was in this department.
Right.
That sort of thing. I want to be able to, and they have every right to expect that.
And that would span a whole cross section of society.
Yes.
So many persons who somehow are linked to the plantation,
I think at one point
to the factory,
yes,
and so on, because that basically was the mainstay of
I
St.
remember
Kitts for so
when
many
my
years.
husband was doing his dissertation, he mentioned 90% of St. Kitts population relied directly or indirectly on the sugar industry. And we cannot preserve these records. And yet, we have records relating to a sugar factory that never was built. Those are safe.
Right.
Which is ridiculous. The ones that should be safe are the ones at SSMC.
Yes.